So everything from now on is recorded, and I'm going to start by introducing Professor Roger Watson. Thank you, Roger, for joining us. You're going to have to turn on your camera and microphone. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Paul. I'm just about to share my camera. Not that it's necessary to see me. I'm assuming that people can hear me because the microphone is on. Yeah, okay, John's giving me the nod. That's always good. Well, thanks a lot for asking me to introduce today. My main aim is not to be too long and not to detract from John. I think the thing that gives me the greatest joy today is watching the names popping up on the right-hand side of the screen and how many of these people I know, and that so far nobody I know has succumbed to this dreadful virus that's going around the world now. But being in the just having entered the high-risk age group, I'm expecting to depart any time, but I'm getting my vaccine soon. But I'm really most glad that John, who claimed to have retired several years ago, doesn't seem to have. He's still working hard and producing books, and I can't really wait to get my hand on this book. I'm lucky enough to have his last one, and what I'm lucky enough to have here, I don't know if others have got it, is a chapter summary, and I'm just going to sort of dip into that and maybe steal a little bit of John's thunder, or hopefully signpost one or two things that he's going to speak about. I used to edit the Journal of Advanced Nursing, as Paul said, until the end of the year. And when I was editing the Journal of Advanced Nursing, we were pretty much flooded with papers called concept analysis or analyses. And these were initially all from North America. They were coming from PhD thesis or PhD projects, and there seemed to be a requirement in North America, particularly in the United States, to produce these concept analysis. And then there was a sort of bandwagon developed, and lots more were coming from other places, many from the UK as well. And ever the pragmatic and ambitious editor-in-chief, I wanted to see how well we were doing with the concept analysis, because they were taking up an increasing amount of space in the journal. And amongst several controversial decisions I've made in my time as an academic and at Jan, we decided to discontinue concept analysis. And we discontinued them on a very simple grounds, and that was that they were almost never cited. I mean, the vast majority were never cited at all. We had to look through many years to find citations to concept analysis. This suggested to me and my colleagues on the editorial team that concept analysis really weren't being used by anyone. Why should we be publishing them? And of course, we need to keep an eye on things like impact factor and citations relative to content. And anybody who doesn't do that is a little bit misguided. So we felt that dropping the concept analysis might help us with that. And what I was most surprised at was the lack of pushback. We did get some. I think Janice Morse wrote an editorial defending them. I had a few private emails from who might be called the usual suspects, but we decided to hold steady. They've gone, and nobody really seems to miss them very much now. A few years ago, I met John and Paul and others at an excellent conference in Worcester on nursing philosophy. I'm by no means a philosopher. I was very flattered to be asked to speak at it, but the concept of concept analysis, if that's possible, John, came up at the conference. And it turned out really, if I'm not mistaken, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that nobody really seemed to know what they were or what purpose they served. So whether John's book will clarify this or put the final nail in the coffin of concept analysis, I don't know, but I can't wait to hear what he's got to say and to read the book. John's challenging as ever, opening up in the first chapter by saying things such as there are no such things as concepts. John's never known to hide his ideas under a bushel, as it were, but I'm sure he'll explain what he means by that. And the aim of the book, he says, is to sow or plant a few seeds of doubt. I'm sure by the end of reading it, or by the end of today's talk by John will have several seeds of doubt. But there are some classic phrases in here, like the fact that a reference to concepts is essential doesn't mean that they exist. And John's going to give us, I think, some examples about that. I don't know what John's going to talk about today, but as I say, these things really whet my appetite. But I thought he's going to use hope as one of the sort of concepts that we often talk about to expand on his ideas. But I thought there was one really interesting phrase towards the end of the chapter summaries, which says, there might be a problem if you create a technical term without realizing that's what you've done, thinking that what you've done is clarified a concept, and goes on to say that this has unfortunate methodological or clinical implications. And this took me right up to the present day, when we seem to be arguing in social media and the press and on the radio about, for example, what a death from COVID means. I mean, we don't even seem to be able to define very concrete things like that. So I think, concept analysis is something that we need to be thinking about and looking at in a little bit more detail. The only thing that concerns me about it is that I see that it's going to take an approach inspired by Wittgenstein. I'm always confused by Wittgenstein, but I'm hoping in the next 20 minutes or so, John can clarify that. I'll hand back to Paul and presumably hand back to John. I'm looking forward to hearing from you, John. Thanks very much for the invitation.
Great, thank you so much, Roger. Before I just pass over to John, just to clarify that you don't need, if you're a participant, you don't need to silence your microphone or turn off your camera. That's all done for us here. So while I'm just going to share John's presentation, and that's it. John requires very little introduction, I'm sure. So he's a visiting fellow now, I'm happy to say, here at the University of Worcester, and I'm delighted to welcome him and ask him to talk about his new book. John, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Roger, for the introduction. I hope it's as interesting as you were hoping it would be. And thanks to Paul and Martin for organising this event, and to everybody who's actually here. Quite an amazing turnout. Just so you can pace yourselves, I'll be talking for about 20 minutes, and then I'll hand over to Sally. Before I get to the main business, which is introducing the book, just a couple of quick preliminaries. First, I think it's important to note that the expression concept analysis is almost exclusive to nursing. Philosophers call what they do, or what some of them do anyway, conceptual analysis. So the new approach referred to in the book's title is new to nursing, not necessarily to philosophy. Second, Lorraine Walker and Kay Avant based their canonical form of concept analysis on an understanding of philosophy as it was in the 1950s, 1960s, maybe the early 70s. I take what I'm doing in this book to be sort of parallel to that. The proposal I'm making about a new approach is also based on an understanding of philosophy, but it's the philosophy of the last 20 years, including its partial convergence with linguistics. So it's the same kind of project, just a bit updated. Okay, so turning to the actual book, it's divided into two parts. There we go. Part one is a philosophical discussion explaining my reasons for adopting a new approach, and part two consists of two examples of it. So if we begin with part one, the argument of part one is concerned with the relationship excuse me, between concepts and uses of words. So if we take an example, the relationship between the concept of hope and various uses of the word hope. And when I say various uses, I'm referring to all the different ways in which hope can be used and has been used. And I'm going to show two different pictures of this relationship, two different pictures we can have of it from the book. The first is what we might call the traditional picture. Whoops, sorry, overshot. In this first picture, we have uses of the word hope, and we have a concept of hope, and they're separate. According to this picture, the concept of hope is an additional something. There are uses of the word hope, and there are many more than 5, of course. This is just a highly schematic diagram. And there is something over and above those uses, namely the concept of hope. And like every concept, it has a structure, an attributes, components, and boundaries. The idea is that the concept with its structure and attributes explains the various uses of the word hope, that the word hope, whenever it's used, expresses one and the same concept of hope. And if you are to use or understand the word hope, you have to understand the concept or have acquired the concept. There are different philosophical theories about what the concepts are, but the two main ones are that they're sort of mental items of some description, and the other is that they're abstract entities. The second picture is a bit less familiar. In this picture, the concept of hope as something over and above the uses of the word has disappeared. All we have are the uses, and again, there are many more than 7. This is just a schematic indication. The expression of the concept of hope, and notice the inverted commas here. This is now just a linguistic expression. It's just a way of referring in very vague and indirect terms to those uses. It's not the name of something extra which explains the uses, and it's not something which is expressed by whenever the uses occur. I suggest in the book that the first picture is the one on which concept analysis in nursing is currently based. It's the picture which underlines attempts to elucidate the structure of a concept by identifying its boundaries, components, attributes, and so on. The second picture is the basis of an alternative approach, or the one I'm proposing anyway. The word concept is used to refer in this vague and indirect manner to an overall pattern of use. In this example, the concept of hope is an expression which refers to the pattern of use of the word hope. It's not the name of an extra something which explains those uses. So part 1 is essentially an argument in favour of this second picture. I'm not going to go into the details of the argument now, take much too long, but I could perhaps say something a bit more later on in the Q&A. But the conclusion of the argument is, as Roger mentioned, that there are no such things as concepts. At least there are no such things as concepts if the word concept is understood in a first picture sort of way. Just a reminder. So there are no such things, in other words, as concepts if concepts are supposed to be mental items or abstract entities which have structures, components, attributes, boundaries, and so forth. So we can't analyse concepts if there aren't any. All we've got are words, but we can explore the use of words. This may seem like a trivial kind of difference, but in part 2 I'll try to show that it's not. Before I turn to part 2, let me just add that the view that there are no such things as concepts is not quite as idiosyncratic and eccentric as it might seem to be. There are several philosophers and cognitive scientists who take a broadly similar view. The reasons aren't the same as mine, and the arguments are different, but I think they'd all sign up to the view that, as Mark Wilson, a philosopher, puts it, we should resist the impulse to consider concepts as well-defined entities. So, right, now we can turn to part 2, which illustrates the alternative approach I'm suggesting. The idea is that instead of trying to elucidate the structure of a concept, we study instead the different uses of the corresponding word or expression. In particular, we examine how those uses vary in different grammatical constructions. The two examples, as Roger mentioned, that I use are hope and moral distress. One's obviously a common or garden term which has come to have clinical significance. The other is an inventive phrase introduced in 1984, which has been the subject of intensive academic discussion in nursing and actually more recently some other healthcare disciplines. For now, I'm just going to talk about hope. The pattern of use associated with hope turns out to be surprisingly complex, so much so that it takes 4 chapters. I remember when I sat down to write this, I was thinking it would just be a single chapter, and I soon realized that it was going to take quite a bit more than that. It is actually very complex. It's difficult then to illustrate the approach I adopt in such a short space of time, but I'll try to give you a sense of how it works by taking just a couple of snippets from the hope chapters. First of all, though, we can look at how hope is described in the nursing literature. So here are a few examples taken from frequently cited papers. It's an extremely varied list, as you can see, and some of the things perhaps fall short of being absolutely crystal clear, but they do have certain things in common. In each case, hope is just one kind of thing. It's an inner kind of thing, sort of inner something, something that's somehow internal to the person, and it can be characterized universally. When I say that, I mean that these accounts of hope all appear to be generalizations. They're taken to be true, always, of the inner something being referred to. Nobody, for example, suggests that hope is an instinct part of the time, or that hope is a theological virtue for some people, or that hope is a multidimensional life force in certain circumstances. Typically, hope statements are made without qualification, as here. It's a bit like when people say what water is. It's a tasteless, transparent liquid, a compound of hydrogen and oxygen. I'm going to contrast these kinds of claim with some familiar everyday uses of the word hope. There's a very wide range of possible examples I could draw on, hence the 4 chapters, but I'll take some statements which involve negations of hope to illustrate the point I want to make. In other words, negative statements with hope in them. So here's a few examples of sentences taken and adapted from the corpus of contemporary American English, COCA, which is an online corpus of English amounting at the moment to 1 billion words. So look at the first of these, number 1. The Panthers, by the way, for anybody who doesn't know, are an American football team. I didn't know either until I was writing this. In this case, it seems clear that hope can't be referring to any state of mind, or to a lack of a state of mind for that matter. The statement may be true, even if the Panthers themselves want to pull it off and think they can. What the speaker means is that in her view, they haven't a chance. In fact, in this example, you can substitute chance for hope and not alter the sense. Can the Panthers pull it off? Not a chance. Similarly with 2, in the speaker's view, there is no chance of hiring a trained toxicologist. And again, this might be true, even if the people to whom the statement is addressed believe that they can hire one and presumably want to. Again, you can substitute chance for hope and you don't alter the sense. There's no chance of hiring a trained toxicologist at the moment. You can make a similar substitution in 3 and 4. For example, Diane has no chance of getting on the stand. So that's examples of hope as a noun. With 5, we move to the verb. The same kind of claim is being made. In the speaker's view, if the Tigers, and now we're talking about a rugby team in England, if the Tigers play like this, there is no chance of them winning anything. And this is a statement, again, that can be true even if the tigers themselves want to win something and think they can win something. In other words, even if the tigers themselves hope to win something. Similarly with 6, the speaker suggesting it's not possible for the proposal to answer all the specifics. Here again, there's no reference to anybody's state of mind. And of course, proposals don't have states of mind. You could, I suppose, say, well, some people might have hoped that the proposal would answer all the specifics, and that refers to people's states of mind. And again, true enough, but the point is simply this, that 6 can be true even if they did. 7 is different, hopeless, the adjective, one of the adjectives. Interestingly, this doesn't usually mean that David is lacking in hope. It means that David is incompetent. He may be actually maybe a hopeful, optimistic sort of chap, but in the speaker's view, he's unlikely to be able to do the task he's been given. And then hopeless in 8 applied to a situation. And again, interestingly, this is true of most of the occurrences, the vast majority of occurrences actually in COCA. They're applied to situations, not to people. And again, what is being conveyed here is that there's no chance of resolving the situation successfully. Again, there's no reference to anybody's states of mind. What all these examples have in common is that according to the speaker, there is no possibility of some particular thing, let's call it X, happening. In each case, this is what's conveyed. There's no reference to anybody's state of mind. It's not being said that anyone lacks a state of mind. Even if we invoke the beliefs and desires of people who want X to happen, the truth of the statement is quite independent of what they think or what they wish for. Their states of mind, however we describe them, are irrelevant to the sense of all 8 sentences. The chapters on hope in general draw attention to the discrepancy between accounts of hope in the literature and the ways in which the word hope is actually used. And it turns out that the job hope does, you could say its function, varies with the grammatical context it appears in. For example, its use in positive statements is different from its use in negative statements, and we just had an indication of how that might be. How it's used in indicative statements is different from how it's used in questions. How it's used in impersonal statements, like there is some hope or there is no hope, is different from how it's used when hope is attributed to a person. And how it's used with ellipsis is different from how it's used without ellipses. These are just some more examples. There are plenty more variations, and that's obviously before we get to the adjectives and the adverbs. Moreover, and here's the crux, the accounts of hope in the nursing, medical, and psychological literatures overlook the vast majority of uses to which the word hope is actually put. It's probably worth saying again because it's a bit counterintuitive. Accounts of hope in academic discussion are based on a narrowly selective range of uses of hope. They overlook most of the variegated pattern, the very complex pattern of uses associated with the word. So here's a rough and ready, and again, highly schematic picture of how the academic discussions go. Here, the various uses of the word hope are in the large oval, and again, there are a lot more than 7, but it is schematic. And the uses of some other word or expression are in the small oval. What the diagram's trying to illustrate is that accounts of hope in healthcare and psychology are typically based on this narrowly selective range of uses. They overlook most of the everyday uses of hope. There should actually be a circle around use 1 and use 7. I'm not quite sure why that's disappeared, but anyway, imagine a circle around use 1 and use 7 with the arrows going up to the theory of hope. So they take the narrowly selective range of uses of hope, and then typically they do something else as well. They take uses of one or more different expressions and graph them onto the uses of hope which they do take account of. And these different words and expressions vary with the author's concern. Some people assimilate hope to optimism. Some people associate or assimilate it to expectation. Some assimilate it to goal-directed thinking or goal-directedness. For example, I think Kay Hirth assimilates hope and optimism, but ordinary usage distinguishes them. We might say, for example, well, I'm hopeful this will happen, but I'm not optimistic. Equally, Dufour and Matocchio assimilate hope and expectation, but it's a familiar thing to say, I did it more in hope than in expectation. However, and here's another fairly crucial point, I'm not saying that because healthcare and psychology usage is at odds with established use, it's therefore mistaken. It's a familiar thing for technical disciplines to appropriate familiar words, ignore many of their ordinary uses, and give them new functions. In physics, for example, work and force are technical terms only distantly related to how they're used in ordinary discourse. In a similar way, I think hope is often a technical term, effectively, in healthcare. So there's no problem about familiar terms being appropriated for new tasks and new functions. However, and this is the bit that Roger referred to in his introduction, there might be a problem if you create a technical term without realizing quite that this is what you've done. And that, I think, is the situation sometimes in nursing and psychology. Many of the writers who have helped to attach hope, the word, to these new functions don't recognize their achievement for what it is. They think they have clarified the concept of hope, taking it to be the ordinary one, or they claim to have analyzed or defined hope as it's ordinarily understood, while perhaps making its boundaries a bit sharper. Sometimes this lack of awareness of the fact that what they've done is identify a technical term hasn't any practical consequences. But in other cases, sometimes I think it does have unfortunate methodological or clinical implications. And I discussed some of these in the last of the Hope chapters. So in conclusion, the idea that a single word or a single expression can have a different sense, a different function in different grammatical constructions is something many people find counterintuitive. Surely, they say, a word must have the same sense, must do the same job whenever it's used. It is, after all, the same word with the same meaning. Why else would we use it? But the question I would ask is, how do you know? How do you know unless you actually look, unless you actually examine its use in different contexts, positive statements, negative statements, as a noun, as a verb, comparing first-person uses with third-person uses, and so on. And this is where Wittgenstein comes in. Again, Roger referred to him. One of his slogans, one of the ones he's known for, is "Don't think, but look." And that's exactly what the alternative approach I'm suggesting involves: looking, actually looking at the pattern of usage of these interesting and important terms and expressions, instead of assuming that they always mean the same thing, whatever grammatical context they appear in. But to see exactly how this works, you will, of course, need to read the whole book, and obviously that's what I'm hoping you'll do. In the meantime, thanks really very much for listening.
Thank you so much, John. I'm going to take that away, and
Okay.
I can see Sally now. I can see John as well. Thank you so much, John. And Martin is gathering questions. So while Sally's speaking, if you can multitask, you can listen to Sally and also write your question. But for now, I'm going to invite Sally, Professor Sally Thorne, to say a few words in response to John's lively presentation. Thank you, Sally.
Thank you so much, Paul. And thank you, John, for this opportunity to respond to your new book. I'll start with the open confession that I came to my reading of John's book, and I did actually read it. I was the recipient of illegal proofs. I came to this reading with a bias. I was first exposed to concept analysis in a graduate student assignment in 1980, and I found the process to render a potentially intriguing idea absolutely tedious. I think the one I selected, maybe we might need to take your microphone off, John. The one I selected was intuition, assuming it might help me understand the fuzzy collection of ideas that nurses had about the role it played in their practice. Instead, it completely discouraged any further interest. And then much later, as a journal editor, like Roger, I was startled to find manuscript submissions that were essentially identical in form and structure to those class exercises of 4 decades ago. And having had the opportunity to engage with the truly interesting ideas that nurse philosophers, such as the group we're gathering with today, engage with, I was curious as to why people were still stuck in the conviction that these entities represented meaningful contributions to knowledge. So when invited to comment on a new book on that topic by the infamous John Paley, sight unseen, I leapt at the opportunity. The ideas of John Paley have been a frequent companion in my intellectual life for many years. I first met him in real time over a beer in 2003 in Stirling, where his nursing philosophy rock band was the featured entertainment at an IPONS conference. This past term, I taught a doctoral level philosophy of nursing course and witnessed once again how provocative his way of working with ideas can be. And when first exposed to his writings, some of my students were quite outraged, questioning his right to say the things he says about their beloved profession, and trying valiantly to mount a logical rationale for why he was wrong. It took them time and practice to begin to appreciate the way in which his distinctive lines of argument, painful and critical as they might feel at times, expose us to things we need to think about in this world of nursing knowledge. This book will undoubtedly become one of those provocative Paley missives when its launch lands it on the desk of those who spent their lives training nursing graduate students to do standard framework concept analysis. I suspect that many of them don't realize that this is a practice distinctive to nursing, not a fundamental theory building exercise that would be recognizable beyond the discipline. And since nursing theory itself, grand, mid-range, or even micro, is not the ultimate end game that so many assumed it would be 40 years ago, it seems about time someone called us on the issue and offered us a different way to think about the ideas we hold dear in this business. So starting with the position that there are no such things as concepts, Paley pushes us to critically reflect on what our purpose is in attaching that nomenclature to an idea, and to consider what it is we do with them when we think of them as concepts versus what else we might do with them if we didn't. He describes this as an exercise in tearing things up and starting again. And he claims we have a collective blind spot in assuming that if we don't categorize things, we could not formulate beliefs or make judgments, and there would be nothing to serve as constituent parts of thoughts or propositions. And he assures us that if we abandon the notion that the nouns populating our internal disciplinary communications require some clarity about what they name, then we can start thinking a little bit more creatively about what it is they actually do when we unleash them into our various contexts. And as he takes us on this intellectual journey, as you've heard, Paley draws rather heavily on Wittgenstein. When I first realized this, I initially got a bit worried, as Wittgenstein was known to be quite violent once he got a fireplace poker in his hand. And we all know that John Paley rarely holds back when he gets emphatic in his arguments. However, the reference to Wittgenstein does serve the purpose quite well in this case, as the point here is trying to dislodge what has become an entrenched picture of language and its relationship to the ideas we believe are constituent to the ontology and epistemology of nursing. And rather than forcing any claims upon us, this version of Paley guides us through his reasoning process in a manner that makes us feel that we're fully entitled to be a part of this intriguing conversation. Among the many concepts he plays with in this journey through language, as you've heard, is the concept of hope, one that I have considerable attachment to since I do research in the field of communication in cancer care. And in his guided tour into what language does in its many and various forms, Paley illustrates how messy, inconsistent, and fluctuating it really is, making a convincing argument that it is really not the words themselves for the most part, but rather their role in context that actually conveys meaningful meaning. And as he puts it, a grammatical construction coerces the meaning out of the individual word. So John's told you a bit about what motivated him to write this book and what he hopes it will achieve. And as promised, he situates you inside the fascinating complexity of what words have to do in order to convey anything resembling meaning. To call in a couple of the strategically placed unbounded metonyms he played with in the course of untangling his arguments, it does seem that the pen truly is more mighty than the sword. So the dance that John Paley takes his reader on with this particular incarnation of his nursing philosophy rock band is lively and entertaining and, of course, delightfully disruptive. He clearly had a great deal of fun working all of this out. And in the end, I was left wondering why, given that nursing's paid so much attention to concepts and the idea of meaning as core to its everyday business, it has so studiously avoided any careful and in-depth study of language. And I have to admit, in trying to prepare a response for this occasion, he did make me incredibly self-conscious about the words I chose in order to make that observation. Thank you so much, John.
Thank you very much, Sally. That was again very, very thoughtful. We've got about 20 minutes left, and I can see that there are a number of questions coming in, and put them to John. For those who've got hands up and who want to ask a question, it's really difficult to enable you to talk. So if you could just type your questions into the chat box, and Martin will keep an eye on it and moderate the discussion with John. So Martin, over to you.
Hello, John. Thank you for that, and thanks, Paul, for the introduction. I think I can see 3 clusters of questions, types of question coming in. I think we've got some questions which hint at practical or use value of your ideas. I think we've got some questions or statements which focus on words in use, and then some questions related to philosophy with a capital P. So let me just begin by asking you about practical or use value. I've had a chance to read your book, and I think within the book it's very clear how the ideas that you're presenting have concrete traction in nursing. But perhaps you could just say a little bit more about that thing. If I was to say to you, what practical value does any of this have for nursing, what would be your response there? Over to you.
Okay. Sorry, frog in my throat. I think it's probably the most important question of the lot. And until Roger spoke, I had 2 possible responses to it. One of them I'm a bit less convinced about now. I was going to say, well, a sort of passive negative response is, if the current form of concept analysis has value, well, in that case, so does this. I think it's only a development, it's an updating, as I said at the beginning, and it kind of occupies the same slot in the array of intellectual work that we can do, but it occupies the slot in a different way. But I think a more convincing response would be actually trying to say something about, well, taking a hope again as an example. because I think it is an important and interesting concept in healthcare. And there are a number of threads to that which I develop in the book, but let's just take one of them, which is the idea of fostering and maintaining hope in healthcare. I'll keep it simple and just say fostering hope, but I mean fostering and maintaining hope is how this is often put. And if you look again at the picture of how the word hope is construed in healthcare, I'm suggesting that those pictures tend to overlook the majority of uses in ordinary discourse of hope and graft on some different concepts. So I mentioned expectation, optimism, goal-directedness, and there are a few others. But how do the different specialized uses of hope affect the fostering project? If you look, for example, at the various hope scales, and there are, I think, up to about 30 different hope scales currently in use. They're all lopsided in slightly different ways. I think the Hearth scales, for example, assimilate hope to optimism. I think the ones that draw on Default and Martocchio assimilate it to expectation. The ones that draw on Snyder or Janice Morse's similar version emphasize goal-directedness. So if you come back to the project of fostering hope, there's a question about what exactly you're talking about. Which one of those forms of hope, which one of those technical terms, those technical uses you have in mind? And the answer to that question is almost certainly going to be dependent on different conditions, different healthcare settings. For example, if by hope you mean the goal-directedness idea, that's clearly going to be appropriate to things like, I don't know, spinal cord injury, for example, where we do actually have evidence that goal setting is an important thing to do. But it's less obvious that that's going to be appropriate to, say, palliative care, where the project of fostering hope isn't going to take that form. It's going to presumably take a different form. Similarly, optimism. Are we talking about just fostering optimism, just a kind of general optimistic, hopeful temperament? And again, that's going to be condition specific, because there's some evidence, I think, that fostering optimism is more effective in some conditions than others. I think, if I remember rightly, it has some impact, the fostering optimism, on multiple sclerosis, but not so much on Parkinson's, that kind of thing. So these are ideas I develop in outline, at least in the last of the 4 hope chapters, and I think that's the way to go in general in answer to the, use value, practical value issue.
Okay, and we also had quite a lot of comments that related to words in use. So Sean, and I'd like to come back to one of Sean's questions in a second, alluded to whether we were just taking greater care in the language that we used, and Savina was talking about how words are used. I think the answer she talks about is to aid understanding, and Peter comments on the changes in word use, and quite a few people have pointed towards words in use. And I think within your book, something you haven't talked about, where this comes out really clearly, and how words in use hits the road is much more concrete. So you've talked about hope. In your other case study, you deal with moral distress. Now, you haven't had a chance to speak about that, but you suggest that moral distress is a normative classification, and that this normative classification bolsters nursing's professional identity. Now, in that discussion, I think some of these ways of talking about words in use comes out really clearly. Would you just say a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's another one of these that could go on all afternoon. There's 2 sides to the discussion of moral distress, but I'll focus on that one. I mean, part of it, that chapter, is tracing the history of the discussions of moral distress in the nursing literature, which is effectively the history of a series of definitions. The paper by Georgina Morley and her colleagues a couple of years ago identified 20 definitions they'd found, and they ended up their paper by adding another one to the list. So there's a partial part of the discussion is about that. But then, yes, as you said, the second half of the discussion is to ask what function moral distress as an expression and as a form of discourse in the nursing literature, what function that has. And I think it is useful to look at it not as the name of a particular state of mind or particular condition of the person, which is what the first half of the discussion that I've just tiptoed around is about, but rather a classification of a lot of different types of situations. If we use constraint language, which is what Jameson originally did, then lots of different types of constraint, like political or legal constraints, organizational constraints, professional dynamic issues, conflicts sometimes with patient families. There's lots of things that have been suggested. And to the outsider, they all look like very different kinds of circumstance, and you wonder why these things are all being classified together. And the analogy I draw is, it's a bit like saying that having a walk and popping down to the shops and taking a holiday in New Zealand are all examples of leaving the house. And you think, well, yes, but what's the point of actually saying that? And can you really study those different phenomena or activities as examples of the same thing in that sense? And I think what the moral distress discourse does is classify a number of different situations as the same, i.e. all examples of moral distress, and in doing so change the narrative. And they change the narrative from problems to do with the law, with interprofessional dynamics, with organizations, into basically something that says moral agent, i.e. nurse, thwarted suffering. And all these situations are elaborated in those terms. And what that does is in literary critical terms, it changes the focalization point. It takes a different angle, and it invites a different kind of response. And as a thought experiment, and again, this is kind of a Wittgensteinian kind of thing, I recall an article from a newspaper 2 or 3 years ago, and an interview with a guy called Dr. Eno, who is a member of Docs Not Cops. And Docs Not Cops is a sort of ginger group which is opposed to the UK government's placing of healthcare staff on the front line of the hostile environment policy. And he says in the interview, this is not what we signed up for. We signed up to be doctors, to do good, to fix people, help people with their health, not to be part of the border force. And I wondered, what does that look like if you turn it into a story of moral distress? And it would mean him saying, the government's hostile environment policy has created moral distress among doctors. And suddenly it's a different kind of narrative. And suddenly it's not about anger or disgust or whatever at government policy. It's all about the doctors. And if somebody then suggested, oh, maybe we should have some way of mitigating this moral distress that doctors are suffering, you'd think, or I would think anyway, actually, you're kind of missing the point here. So, that's just a comparison. It's just about my response to that sort of thought experiment. But I think what moral distress is doing is, as you were saying, bolstering this narrative concerning nursing's identity, and in particular, moral agent thwarted suffering.
Okay.
Sorry, that was a bit long-winded.
Not at all. I've got some questions here. Sean Williams points out towards the merit of conceptual analysis now. So within a wider frame of philosophic thinking, what would be the merit of conceptual analysis now? And Austin Snowden asked about the use of concept analysis from within a Wittgenstein frame. I appreciate that there's not really time to engage with those questions now. Are there any last words you'd like to say?
Yeah, sure. Could I preface it by saying two things, two prefaces. First, hi Austin. And secondly, if anybody's sitting there with a question that they're not going to be have time to ask or get answered, you might want to write to me via email. And I will actually undertake to reply to any questions that people want to put to me about either part 1 or part 2 on the book as a whole or whatever. So if you're sitting there thinking, well, I've got a concept in mind, what are you going to do with that? Write to me and ask, and I undertake to reply. So concept analysis, Wittgenstein. I think it's difficult to overstate the degree to which, I mean, another thing I use in the book is construction grammar, as you'll remember, which I think is an actual adjunct to Wittgenstein. And Sally mentioned it in terms of the way in which grammar, however counterintuitive this may seem, coerces the sense of different words. And yes, I can imagine that is a form of discourse analysis, or a discourse analysis as an expression covers a very wide range of different stuff. So it could easily cover this as well. And
Michael Trainer points towards that as well.
Yes, I noticed that on the panel. I think it's a very Wittgensteinian take on discourse analysis, although I can quite see the two things coming together, because one of the things you do in discourse analysis, or at least the versions I'm familiar with, is you ask what the functions of certain items in language are, not just what they mean. And that's very much the approach that I use here. It's about asking, what are these words and expressions in these particular grammatical contexts actually achieving? What is their function? And I think, yes, that does echo discourse analysis. That was a bit shorter.
Yeah. Paul, are you going to come back in now? Because we've only got 3 minutes left, I think, till...
Yeah, thanks, Martin. We've did you, John? Did you want to carry on a bit, or?
I'm happy to do that. If people are straining at the leash and want to ask more questions, that's fine.
Okay, so John and I and Martin did discuss the possibility of extending this session, although I did say at the beginning it was going to close at 5 o'clock. This is the kind of electronic version of people crowding round after the doors to the lecture theatre have been flung open, wanting to talk. So what I'm going to say is that please feel free just to drift off, because this is 5 o'clock now, and I'm sure many of you have got other things to go to. But on the other hand, and I want to say a big thank you to John and Sally and Roger, but it seems churlish to cut everyone off while there's conversations to be had. So until I see on my control panel here that people are not wanting to engage anymore, Martin and John and Sally and Roger, if you're all happy, then I'm proposing just to carry on. The electronic timer's set for another half an hour or so. So, Martin, if you've got other things to put to John, why don't we just carry on?
Thanks, Paul, and thanks just in passing to everyone who did send in comments and questions. And I apologise because I'm sure I've missed out saying lots of things that you would have liked me to have said. John, why can't nursing have its own form of concept analysis, different from that advanced by other groups?
It can, it has, and I never said it couldn't. The book doesn't say it can't. I think this is an important point to make as well. But it comes back to the point I made very early on in my presentation, which is that nursing's own brand, if you like, of concept analysis is not 100% homegrown. It is based, or was based originally by Walker and Avant, on their understanding of what philosophy was like at the time, and you look at their sources, and it's basically analytic philosophy of the 50s, 60s, early 70s, before the big sea change in philosophy which occurred in the late 70s with Kripke and Putnam and philosophy of language. So in a sense, I'm imitating Walker and Avant, as I said before, in that I'm starting with philosophy, just a more recent version. And which includes the linguistics. But in other respects, it is parallel because I'm basing an approach to concept analysis on that. But that's not to say that the argument is, well, you should stop doing that and start doing this instead. I'm offering an alternative in the sense that it's a genuine alternative to doing this. If you're happy to carry on doing what we understand as concept analysis now, I'm not going to kind of protest or jump up and down and go frothy at the mouth. That's perfectly serviceable. We do have alternatives within the current form of concept analysis. We've got the Walker and Avant method, we've got evolutionary method, we've got the hybrid method, and several more. So you've already got a choice between alternatives. This is another one. I don't think there's much to choose between the others because I think they're all basically variations on the same theme. But you do have a choice, and this gives you an extra one.
Okay. Let me put something to you that you've pushed back against in the past when we've talked about it, but I think it is, I'd like to try again. I think the value of this book, and one of the really interesting things that came out to me when I read it, was that when we take seriously the language that we use and the way that language is constructed and played with, it really does challenge a great deal of the assumptions that are made across a very wide range of nursing literatures, not just concept analysis. Would you say anything about that?
How long have we got, did we say? Yes, I mean, I think that's true. I think there are various ways in which the nursing literature, but not just the nursing literature, actually. I mean, I'm saying the expression concept analysis is more or less unique to nursing, but a lot of the assumptions that are made about concepts and related issues in nursing are shared by other disciplines, by a lot of philosophers, by quite a lot of psychologists and so on. So it's not just nursing that we're talking about in principle here. And I think this kind of approach, which does, as Sally was saying, it kind of changes your picture of how language actually works. And once you've got your head round that, and it's not a thing anybody's going to do overnight. I mean, it took me longer than that anyway. Then it does start to get you asking questions, I think, about, in a way, kind of questions you haven't asked before, and in a way that you haven't actually asked them. And the whole idea of looking at usage is, I think, again, in nursing, more so than the other disciplines, is actually quite innovative, particularly because, and I don't think you can overstate it, the way in which when people step back from the language that they use and think about a concept, Jody Azuni says somewhere that thinking about concepts makes you forget about language. And it's kind of a bit of an overstatement, but I think he's right. We step back from language, we think about a concept, and then we start coming up with these characterizations of something like hope, which are just based on one very narrowly selective range of usage. And that applies to a lot of stuff that we can approach in the same way. For example, in words like hope, i.e. common or garden words that have clinical significance, plenty of those. Know, for example, at its cognates, know, knows, knowing, knowledge, all of those. I think that's ripe for an approach of this kind. And there are plenty of other concepts in the same boat. I mean, you know, trust, experience. Experience is a really good one, because that illustrates what you were saying. It's not just about the, you know, patient experience, for example. It's about the whole of qualitative research, because these days qualitative research is defined effectively as the study of experience, and experience turns out to be an amazingly complex word. The best discussion of it I know is Anna Wierzbicka's discussion of experience, her chapter in a book called Experience, Evidence and Sense, I think. And it's a historical linguistic account, and it's just completely eye-opening. And anybody who is thinking about studying experience or talking about it in whatever context, I would say go and read that first. So yeah, I mean, there's all these links, and it's actually quite exciting thinking about them. You want another one?
Well, oh, it's me. I can hear my own voice coming back, which is very strange. Now, the experience point you were making, I think, is an excellent point. I've never really known what that word meant. I think that's and I shall look that thing up. One of the points we thought might come up but didn't was around the possible Anglo-centric nature of this discussion.
That was going to be the point I was going to make next when I said you want another one, because I think that's, yeah, mine's thinking alike. It is Anglo-centric. There's a I don't know if some people will have seen it on Google Books. There's a paragraph in the first chapter about it, which says this is a very Anglo-centric book. And there are various friends and colleagues who have pointed the same thing out to me and explained how English is different in various respects from Italian on these topics, or Swedish or French. And I think with the first picture I showed, we get the sense that there is a single concept, and it underlies not just uses of hope in English, but uses in French of espoir and espérer, uses in Italian of sperare and speranza. My apologies for my pronunciation to both countries. But the second picture suggests there is no underlying concept. There is no single underlying concept that accounts for all these things. In French, you've got le concept de l'espoir, is a reference to the pattern of usage of espoir and espérer in the same way that I've talked about the pattern of usage of hope. In Italian, il concetto di speranza, I think I've got that right, is a reference, again, vague and indirect, to the pattern of usage associated with sperare and speranza. And I think the cross-linguistic possibilities here are absolutely fascinating and exciting. And if anybody out there, you know, wants to talk about the cross-linguistic side of this, please, again, do write to me, and I'll definitely respond, because I think that could be some really exciting stuff to be done there.
And it's just been brought to my attention. I missed it earlier. Daniel had raised that point, and I'd not seen it. So apologies there, Daniel.
And Sabine Schoffenhauer, I think, mentioned that as well.
Oh, right. Well, there you go. If only I could read, it would be very useful. John, your presentation did skip over quite a lot of part one. Are there any other key points you'd want to bring out from part one?
Yeah, I suppose. I did skip over it because some of it's quite dense, and it uses unfamiliar terms. I mean, which are all explained hopefully in the glossary and when they're introduced. And it's the kind of thing you can give a quick summary of in 5 minutes. I think the point I would want to make is that underneath it all, but I don't make a big thing about this, there is a view which I associate with people like Noam Chomsky, Jody Azuni, Robert Matthews, and a few others, which you can't read the ontology off the syntax. So in this particular case, the fact that concept is a noun doesn't commit you to an ontological view that says there are concepts. And as Jody Azuni points out, we make lots of true statements about things that don't exist. If I say, you know, Tom the cat is constantly trying to catch Jerry the mouse, that's a true statement, but neither Tom nor Jerry exist. I mean, it's a trivial example, obviously, but Azuni talks about lots of scientific statements about, say, frictionless planes, which are true, but frictionless planes don't exist. So the idea is that we can make true statements about things without an ontological commitment. So if I agree, for example, that somebody has the concept of such and such, or understands the concept of such and such, right? That can be true. I mean, I make a point of saying I don't deny in the book that it is true sometimes to say that such and such a person has the concept of something. So that can be true. But it doesn't commit, I don't think of it as committing me to the idea that there is a something called a concept which the person has. So then you have to get into lots of discussions about the use of the verb have, which is another of these short, very commonly used, usually Anglo-Saxon words, which turn out to have immensely complex patterns of use. Won't go into that now, but I'll just re-emphasize the point that the idea, I think, of part one, underlying that idea, is this sense that the use of a noun, even in a true statement, does not necessarily commit you ontologically. And saying that somebody has the concept of democracy or understands it does not commit you ontologically to the idea that there are such things as concepts. And just one further observation on that, and with apologies to Roger and anybody else who has a problem with Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein says, and it's one of the most important things I think he said, which is that a lot of problems in philosophy arise because when we come across a substantive, by which he means a noun or a noun phrase, we immediately start looking for the object it's the name of. And he says doing that is what leads us to a lot of difficult and basically unresolved philosophical problems. So you put that next to what people like Chomsky, Matthews, and Azuni are talking about, and what you have is the idea that it's not the case whenever you come across a substantive, you've got to look for the thing that it's a name for. And with me, as I say, I'm quite happy to agree that Judy has the concept of squirrel or democracy or whatever it happens to be, but I then don't go looking for the thing that she, as it were, possesses. And I think most people do. They just assume, because it's drilled into us at a very young age. A noun is a naming word, a verb is a doing word, adjective is a describing word. So a noun is a naming word. And if you look at noun in the dictionary, it says it's a class of words that names things, people and places, or a collection thereof. So it's constantly reinforced, this idea of nouns name things. And that's what we've got to get past, I think. We've got to drive a wedge between saying this noun is useful to the point of being indispensable, like concept, but it doesn't name anything.
I don't know if you can see the comments. Anne Mayo has suggested that many healthcare policy decisions in the United States of America are based upon quantitative measurement. Many believe the instruments used, presumably in capturing these things, lack considerations of the linguistic underpinnings of, for example, diverse patients and families. So I think Anne is there pointing towards similar themes that you were just discussing, I think. And apologies, Anne, if I've misconstrued what you're saying. I thought that was really interesting, John. I mean, if we had infinitely more time, I'd just push you on the same points, really, and to give more and more examples, because I think they make your argument really well. Paul, do you want to come in Have you got anything you'd like to add?
No, I haven't got anything to add. I don't know if Roger's still in the room. If he wanted to say a few words before we go. Here's Roger. Did you want to say a few things, Roger?
Well, I'm still here. I'm still here. Yeah. I didn't have a question because it was asked by Martin near the beginning. I'm always looking for practical examples, and he did point John towards that, and we got a good answer. I just think it's been an excellent session, and I'm going to get the book as soon as I can. I don't know why I didn't get it before this, but that was just probably laziness on my behalf. But I'm definitely going to get onto it's Google Books, I think, so I'll get onto Google and get it there. So thanks very much, John, for answering the questions, but nothing else to ask.
It's just become available on Amazon now.
All right. Okay. Right.
So that's an alternative.
Yeah. Is there a discount, John, for bulk purchase there for Roger if he wants to
not on Amazon, but
stock up for Christmas early?
They have, in usual Amazon fashion, they have knocked something off the eye-watering price.
So I'm going to. I can see that the numbers of people dwindling. We still got 60 odd in the room chatting. So but I'm kind of suggesting we call it a day. I don't know if I just want to read that comment from Derek Selman out. He's Derek, as many will know, is a former editor of Nursing Philosopher, and he reports the sinking feeling whenever concept analysis appeared in the title of a submitted work. So I think that's probably something that we can leave with, saying that was in the old way, and now John's presented with us a new way. So I'm going to suggest we kind of wrap it up there. Go on, Martin, were you going to say something?
I was going to say, right at the last moment, Leanne, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, has begun a new line on theory practice gap. I think there's not time now to pick that up, but that would be another way into this issue.
Okay. Roger, you've come back on. Did you mean to?
Oh no, sorry, I'll go off now.
You go off. Okay, so I'm gonna say thanks to everyone again. I'm gonna thank John and Roger and Sally and Martin for their valuable contributions, and everyone for writing their questions. I'm going to be sending out details tomorrow via email, not through Eventbrite, but from my account here, and I'll include details of the book and the discount you can get from it. It's quite a bit of money for the hardback, but there is an e-version which is possibly more affordable. And I'm also going to I'll remind people of John's email address, so if they want to correspond with him, and also to remind everyone that we are planning a further event once everyone's had time to digest, so we will be planning on that, and I'll be sending more details. So I'm now going to say thank you again and close the meeting, and I hope to see many of you again on another day.
And please thanks to everybody who came.